Make no mistake, this is history in the making. 10-20 years from now, historians will possibly describe tonight's meeting between the US President and the Indian Prime Minister as a defining moment in India's relationship with the US and a strategic shift in the way India sees the world and the world sees India. President Biden has rolled out the red carpet for Prime Minister Modi. He's there on a state visit. But more importantly, the US seems more than willing to share some of its advanced tech with India. And that's really the big change if we were to sum up on what's happening in this visit. This is the same US that once chided India for nuclear tests. The decisive change in the stance comes in the midst of China's growing belligerence and Russia's war against Ukraine. Add to the mix a pandemic that came as a rude shock to the world, a world that relied heavily on an unreliable China. And it becomes easier to see why the two biggest democracies are openly embracing each other like never before. We're going to be talking about the significance of the announcements we've heard so far and what we could expect to hear in the press conference coming up in about an hour from now. But before that, let's listen in to what Prime Minister Modi and President Biden said ahead of the bilateral meet.
With your partnership, we've invigorated and elevated the Quad between the United States, India, Australia, and Japan to advance our vision of a free, open, secure, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Decades from now, people will look back and say the Quad bent the arc of history toward global good, as the Prime Minister describes it. Together, India and the United States are working closely on everything from ending poverty and expanding access to health care, to addressing climate change, to tackling food and energy insecurity stoked by Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine. We've made critical and emerging technologies the pillar of our next generation partnership to ensure that these technologies promote and protect our values, remain open, accessible, and trusted and secure.
भारतीय समुदाय के लोग अपने टैलेंट, कर्मठता और निष्ठा से अमेरिका में भारत की शान बढ़ा रहे हैं। आप सब हमारे संबंधों की असली ताकत है। आज आपको दिए गए सम्मान के लिए मैं राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन और डॉक्टर जिल बाइडेन का हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं। उनका जितना धन्यवाद करूं उतना कम है। और जैसा राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन ने अभी जिसका उल्लेख किया, वी द पीपल, हम दोनों देश अपनी विविधता पर गर्व करते हैं। हम सर्वजन हिताय सर्वजन सुखाय इस मूलभूत सिद्धांत में विश्वास रखते हैं।
All right, to speak more on this, I'm joined now by Leela K. Ponnappa, former career diplomat and former deputy NSA. Maruf Raza, consultant and strategic affairs expert, is with me on the show, as is Manoj Joshi, distinguished fellow at the ORF. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for speaking with us this evening on the India development debate. Ambassador Ponnappa, let me begin with you and ask you, when we're talking about India and America being one of the key partnerships of the century, this being a milestone visit, etc., is there substance to that beyond, of course, all the diplomatic jargon which we're bound to hear in the middle of a state visit?
Well, it becomes incumbent on the players to give substance to this relationship. Does it have the potential for substance? Very definitely so. I think we need to take a look at, there are two big pictures. There's the big picture, which is the strategic situation internationally, not just in the Indo-Pacific. Europe is in turmoil. China is getting not just assertive, but also aggressive. And between Europe and the Pacific, I believe the only country that presents some stability and hope of a partnership for the United States is India, because they have not yet mended their ties with Iran. It's going to be work in progress. And India, for other reasons, for the growth of our economy, for the democracy that we cherish, and for the strength of the participation of the Indian American community in the United States, really presents a very vibrant opportunity for the United States. Now, you talked about the defense deals, some of which have already been signed. That's very good for corporate America and for jobs over there. But it serves, there is a mutual interest, obviously, because India's security requires it to be able to counter some of the kinds of threats that it is likely to face other than those that it already faces. But this is not, these things don't get defined just by one event. It was a very nice welcome that President Biden gave our Prime Minister. The right atmosphere was created. But you notice that President Biden really placed the whole visit in context. He talked about, of course, the strength of the bilateral relationship and his relationship with the Prime Minister. He also put it in the context of the Quad. And he mentioned Ukraine, and I suppose he had to do that. So I think America is looking at it in the larger context. China was not mentioned, but it was unspoken in terms of the Indo-Pacific. Now, in terms of whether it's the defense deals, whether it's the science and technological cooperation and investment and so on and so forth, there's always the nitty-gritty to be worked out. For example, the jet engine deal. America has very tough regulatory frameworks for export of strategic items and material. And there is often a tortuous process that anybody within the US and the partner country have to go through in order to get the necessary clearances. We've seen this in another context during the civil nuclear negotiations before the deal finally came through. But here we are talking actual manufacturing technology, and that's going to take time. So the challenge is before us. The opportunity is also before us. But to answer your question, is there substance in what we are hearing? There can and there should be substance in what we are hearing, but that has to be done. That's going to be work in progress.
Potential of substance, but we have to see how these actually pan out. I'm going to come to Maruf Raza on this GE jet engine deal, which is being called a game changer in the context of finally there is a transfer of technology. Maruf, is it that significant? Put it into context for us.
You see, India has been engaging with the US for decades now. It also tried to create its own jet engine for its locally manufactured version of fighter aircraft, the Kaveri engine. But there have been a lot of bumps on the way. I mean, I remember some of the LCA scientists speaking at a seminar which I attended in Bangalore, where they said they were in the US, where they were going through the wind tunnel tests, and suddenly there was the nuclear test that India had carried out, and America bundled them back to India, and the program went back to square one. Subsequently, India has been looking for variants for its LCA Mark II, the Tejas Mark II, and that is going to be the large part of the inventory of the Indian Air Force, especially so as the Indian Air Force chief has made a public comment, which is a rarity, to say that India is not going to be able to bank on Russian equipment technology for its Air Force in the coming years because of Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine and various other military commitments. So therefore, India was looking for something. India has been negotiating hard with the US for this. The General Electric's F414 engine is the top line American fighter engine, which is currently in use in 8 countries where America has very special relationships with. And it is also used by frontline American fighters like the F-18E Hornet, the Growler, and even the Saab, a Swedish aircraft which has been pitching to try and fill in the gap for the Indian Air Force, has been using this engine. So this engine is going to be very important. But the more important aspect is not the engine per se. It's going to be the fact that the relationship between India and the US will really transcend a buyer-seller relationship. It's going to be a partnership which is the sort that the US has not been able to establish with India in the past several decades. The Russians have been good at that. The Russians have therefore supplied us Sukhoi aircrafts, more or less lock, stock, and barrel. It has supplied us MiG-29s. It has supplied us nuclear submarine. It has supplied us other naval technology. It supplies us the mainstay of our ground forces, the armor, T-72, T-90 tanks, the BMP-1 and 2. So clearly, the Americans want to enter this field both to make money through the Indian market and to wean India away from dependence on Russia and military systems. So this is a major sort of step in that direction. The second thing is that with this kind of technology that India can manufacture through American assistance, India will be able to fulfill the dwindling requirements of the Air Force, which is now close to 1/4 less than what the Air Force talks about a full inventory that it requires of 42 squadrons. So therefore, these engines will quickly make up that. Initially, probably the engines will be fitted as they are in our aircraft frames and later manufactured here. The more important aspect is that defense deals apart, this is part of an overall defense and critical technology arrangement that India has now been negotiating with the Americans, particularly with Mr. Doval backing those arrangements in a big way, so that it's not just aircraft engines. We've just done a deal with them for $3 billion for the MQ-9 drones, which are very lethal, long distance, long staying power drones, and that can carry weapons platforms, both to operate on land and sea, which is very important for our fight back against a possible China-Pakistan collusion and India's role in the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific. And the critical technologies that will come from America, which is all expected to be signed and sealed in this visit of Mr. Modi, would also include technology like ORAM and others that is going to give a push out to the Chinese efforts to try and dominate the Indian markets with 5G technology. So this is really the promise that America has been making to India. And please remember that in the 75 odd years since our independence, there have been a lot of broken promises or disappointments, whether America trying to wean India into an anti-communist bloc in 1950s, whether America leaning clearly towards Pakistan and China in the 71 war, whether America suddenly announcing thumping on the table sanctions against India after the nuclear tests of Pokhran, and then suddenly the turnaround, because
I presume
America
the point you're
realized that
making, Maruf,
Pakistan
is that
cannot be
we have
relied
to
on.
see how these pan out. We have to see how these promises pan out. While we're talking about all this serious stuff, we just showed you some interesting pictures of the setting for the dinner. The state visit comes with this fancy dinner, and we have the details of that menu. It's a vegan menu which has marinated millet and grilled corn kernel salad, compressed watermelon, tangy avocado sauce. There's stuffed portobello mushrooms. You're probably seeing pictures of the dessert, which is a rose and cardamom infused strawberry shortcake. So those are all the treats on the table as far as the state dinner is concerned, but we are more worried about the digestible stuff, which will really count for something after that. Manoj Joshi, the mention of Quad, and Ambassador Ponnappa brought it up. Mr. Biden said specifically that the Quad is changing the arc of current geopolitics. That context becomes very, very important, doesn't it? It actually displays in a sort what this partnership is about vis-a-vis both China and Russia.
Well, all I can say is that if we have read any of the recent statements of the Quad, they have had virtually no military content. They have really related to a lot of cooperation in vaccines, infrastructure, in resilient supply chains, and so on and so forth. And so from there, the point I would like to make is that what we are really watching, what we've seen, there's a lot of talk, defense deals, G414 engines, etc. But at the heart of the matter is how the US sees India, the place that the US assigns to India in its larger economic plans. And when I say economic plans, it's because the Biden administration has turned the old Washington consensus inside out. In the old days, the United States believed in free trade, open markets, and things like that. But in the last 2 years, we've seen the Biden administration articulating its point of view, and its point of view goes 100% against what the Americans argued earlier. So now what they're talking about is industrial policy, innovation, meaning the US is getting back into the business of becoming an industrial power. It's always been an innovation power. It no longer talks of FTAs. For example, they now talk of bilateral economic arrangements. The person who is behind all this and who has articulated this very well is Mr. Jake Sullivan, who is the National Security Advisor of the United States. And he has been pointing out, and the thrust of the remarks are really what he says are aimed at setting things right for the American middle class. Because what they believe is that the policy of the 90s, the so-called Washington consensus, hollowed out American industry. It hollowed out American industry. It impoverished its middle class. And now they need to reset things. The point I'm trying to make is that India's real importance is not so much on the defense side. I don't think that the United States expects that Indian Navy or Indian forces will be fighting next to them in Taiwan or in the South China Sea. I think the place that they see for India is a partner in their economic plans, economic rejuvenation, the new industrial policy, the new innovation policy, resilient supply chains that they plan to move away from China. And I think this is a very different thing from the casual perspective that you get when you look at things like G414 engine or the MQ-9 Reaper drones, etc. They are important. They're very important. Just on Tuesday, John Kirby, who is the spokesman for the National Security Council, when he was asked whether China was the central focus of the visit, and he had a one-word answer. He said, no, China is not the focus. But of course, we know that anyone who believes that
I
can
think
believe anything.
If he said yes,
China will be the focus.
No, with all due respect, I think if he said yes, that's all we would be talking about right now. Okay, Maruf Raza wants to come in. Yes, Maruf. Everyone, I request brief responses because we want to pack more and more into this limited time we have. Yes,
you need to give me as much time as you've given the others.
I think I have, sir. Yes, Maruf, quick response. Everyone with quick responses, please.
Well, Dr. Joshi is a learned observer of Indo-US relations. I believe he has a PhD on the subject. But what is important is to understand that while I agree with him that Mr. Biden is turning things around in Washington and the Washington approach to things, and there is a consensus in Washington about the role India can play as a partner for the US, not as an ally, because India has traditionally been allergic to any alliance, but a partnership. And the kind of partnership that India and the US is talking about goes far beyond being an ally. Remember, Pakistan was designated as an important non-NATO military ally. But what did it lead to? Pakistan being dumped at the end of the day. Here, the US is looking at, deep engagement in India and the Indian market. So while, yes, defense deals are important for India to be able to address its security concerns, America sees India and its market and the opportunities it offers as very important. And this has been on the American horizon ever since the Indo-US nuclear deal of 2008. I believe that time Condoleezza Rice was on record to say that this is a $100 billion deal, which means that it will be that kind of opportunities. So India has to now look at America as a supplier of clean energy, nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. We kind of stumped ourselves and hit ourselves on our ankles with our nuclear liability laws. And therefore, American companies, which are all privately owned, didn't want to get into the kind of financial commitment that if a nuclear accident takes place, what they'll do. France and Russia are the two other suppliers to India, but their defense and nuclear companies are largely owned by the state. So state can bear such costs. So India will have to make those internal adjustments. And we are only looking at what America is wanting to sell us, what we are going to buy. Yes, that's important. But America is looking at critical technologies that India can take, critical mineral related activity in Jammu and thereabouts area, which can give India the rare earth minerals that India needs to grow. So we are looking at joint growth. But there is a point I made in an article today, which I wrote, and I said there is one area which people are not talking about. You see, India is a country that enjoys goodwill in Moscow and in Washington. So if you want to see India playing a geostrategic role, it's not as a tailcoat hanger in Quad, which, as Dr. Joshi rightly brought out, does not have a military or a maritime context. It's waffling all kind of things, bilateral trade, vaccines, etc., etc. But what about India being the country to go to bring peace in Europe and Ukraine, because it enjoys goodwill amongst the two
We had that
major
opportunity
warring
for a
parties?
year. If we wanted to do that, we had that opportunity for a year. We made it very clear that, we back peace.
No, these things, see,
We didn't want to
Tamanna,
get in the middle of it.
these things happen over a period of time.
Okay.
You have
Ambassador
to see the
Ponnappa
mood,
wants to come in.
and the world
Let's
world is exhausted, and they can't find answers to the Ukraine conflict, and that affects everybody.
Okay.
Europe,
Ambassador Ponnappa
the
wants to come
global
in. Yes,
south,
ma'am.
everybody.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. One comment. Manoj's point about the economics of it rather than the political or the strategic or the military aspects. I think a reading of American history indicates that throughout their history, issues of trade and tariffs have always been an issue, whether domestically or with regard to America's trading partners, and this continues today. What is new now is that the geopolitics and the geoeconomics stand merged. And this was particularly true after the pandemic, after the whole supply chain crisis, the issue on components, which really held back manufacturing in so many sectors, in so many countries, including ours. So this is really the combination of factors and a progression from the time when we were just talking about some limited military cooperation, which progressed through many avatars, if you will, in terms of agreed minutes and so on, the 4 basic agreements by which America could share technology and information with India, and so on and so forth. Whereas now we are into the area of critical infrastructure and materials. AI is a big question mark really for much of the world in terms of what it can do, what it will do, and how it should or how it could be regulated. And I believe America is looking to try to fashion some kind of fresh regional security architecture, not through an alliance, because as I think both Maruf and Manoj said, an alliance is, in fact, some of the US's European partners at a fairly high military level, I have heard them talk of how it really works for the US. And if you recall Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's book on the myth of independence, you sign an alliance, you get into an alliance with the superpower. It's for the superpower's interests, not for your own. So it's a partnership. And both India and America are having to learn how to deal with the partnership, whether it is in terms of India's
It's a
relations
transactional
with Russia,
partnership.
whether it is in terms of what America does with Pakistan from time to time.
Yes.
So,
let me come back to Dr. Joshi on the specific point of the obvious attempt to wean away India from its dependence on Russia for arms. And I take your point that there's an economic part which was very, very important. But just to focus on that for a bit, is this going to be enough? One fighter, jet engine deal, drones, etc. Because Russia is still a very important and crucial supplier of defense equipment to India.
Well, Russian equipment in the Indian military will be there for another 2 decades. 2 decades, meaning you're still going to have T-70, T-90 tanks, you're going to have BMPs, you're going to have the Sukhois and everything. And by the way, the Russians provided us all the technology for a jet engine back in the year 2000. The big problem, in the GE 414 deal is, can India absorb that technology? India spends only 0.7% of its GDP on R&D. And this is the key. All this talk of high technology, etc., depends eventually on, can we absorb that technology? So as I said, we didn't absorb the Sukhoi 30 technology, though it was given to us. It was there on a platter to us. So this is the problem that we confront in this relationship, that a lot of the burden, it's not on what America is offering. It is on what we can absorb. And I think this is the point where you're going to have a major problem, because you do not have that capacity, you do not have the plans, and you don't have the organizations which can do that. And I think that at the end of the day, what we're going to happen, that's why I talked of the industrial and economic part of the relationship, because the defense part of it, the US, the US is by far the greatest military power in the world today.
True.
Meaning it has no rival. The Chinese don't even approach it closely.
Okay.
But in the economic side, they do have a problem, or they perceive that they have a problem. So the challenge is really on the economic side, not so much on the military side. That's why I keep on insisting that they don't want us for the military part of it.
Interesting perspective there. Interesting perspective there. I'm out of time though, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. Just a quick reminder to our viewers, there is going to be a press conference, a rare press conference in about half an hour or so, where Prime Minister Modi and President Biden will take questions and address the media. Do tune in for that. Stay with ET Now.